Hello everyone, and welcome to this very special event. My name is Katie Hessel. I'm an art historian and I run the Great Women Artists Instagram and podcast. And tonight I am delighted to say that we are focusing on Artemisia Gentileschi, the most acclaimed woman artist of the Italian Baroque period. She is currently the subject of a major, extraordinary exhibition at the National Gallery here in London, which celebrates her extraordinary life and work. While Artemisia's paintings were much admired during her lifetime, like many of her contemporaries, she was overlooked in later centuries, and it is only since the 1970s that she has been rediscovered and become the focus of scholarly research, as well as of biographies, gender-focused university courses, and television documentaries, films, and plays, among others. I'm really looking forward to discussing this extraordinary artist and setting her within the context of her own times and exploring resonances with women artists of the 20th and 21st centuries. Joining me tonight are Letizia Treves, the Sassoon Curator of Later Italian Painting at the National Gallery here in London. She is also the curator of the gallery's exhibition, Artemisia, the first ever to be held on her in the UK, which runs until the 24th of January 2021. And of course, Edoardo Roberti, the Senior Director at Sotheby's in London and a specialist in the Old Masters Painting Department. So this event is going to run for about 45 minutes. For the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to be in conversation with Letizia and Edoardo. Then we'll be answering some of your questions, which you can start submitting now. Underneath the video screen, you will see a web form where you can enter your name and also your question. To submit your question, please enter your details in the respective box and click submit. We look forward to engaging with your questions and comments a little later. So I'd love to start off this discussion by asking, why does Artemisia Gentileschi stand out among the 17th century Old Masters? Letizia, let's start with you.
Well, I think she's simply the most celebrated female painter of the 17th century. And I hope that the show demonstrates she's also one of the most significant artists of the Italian Baroque.
Absolutely. Edoardo, why does she stand out for you?
I don't have too much to add to what Letty said. She's an extremely beautiful painter, let's not forget. And quite apart from the impact she has had and continues to have on the role of female painters, she's an extremely innovative painter in her own right, irrespective of gender.
Absolutely. So this is the first exhibition of Artemisia's work in the UK. Letizia, tell us a bit about how the Artemisia exhibition at the National Gallery came together.
Sure. Well, the idea really came from our acquisition in summer 2018 of our first painting by Artemisia. It's a self-portrait of St. Catherine of Alexandria, and the picture was just discovered in 2017. We bought it the following year, and it underwent a conservation treatment, and here you can see the picture both before and after its treatment. And it's actually a treatment that we recorded through a series of short films that we put out through social media, so basically the public could follow in almost real time the conservation of the picture. And we got a real sense of the kind of mounting excitement internationally about this picture. And we decided quite soon after its acquisition that we really wanted to put on a show of her work. And it's really the first one in the UK. And for me, I have to say, it's been absolutely thrilling to see this picture, which, as I say, is quite a new discovery, for the first time hanging alongside other paintings by Artemisia in the exhibition. And she's on this incredible wall lineup of self-portraits. And for me, that's been a real thrill. And of course, there have been an increasing number of exhibitions in recent times, in the last sort of 20 years or so. But I think in my show, the aim was not to sort of include every painting by Artemisia. I set out with a very clear purpose to really have sort of 30 of her best firmly documented and attributed works that really form the core of the exhibition. And the exhibition is broadly chronological. And really through these works, really explain in as clear a way as possible her sort of artistic trajectory. And the other key thing that I wanted to bring in was Artemisia's personality. And so you really get a sense of her as a woman, as an artist, and really get to hear her voice, both through her letters and also the transcript of the trial, which I'll talk about in a moment. So I think it's that more sort of rounded picture of Artemisia that really comes out.
Absolutely. And of course, the launch of the exhibition was also delayed due to the pandemic.
I know. I mean, it was so disappointing. Everything was ready. The spaces were ready. We just were waiting for the pictures to arrive. It was really odd. It was sort of like pressing pause on this huge project that I'd been living with for 2 years. But I mean, you know, we worked tirelessly during lockdown, really, to sort of renegotiate every loan. It's like putting on a second exhibition 6 months later. But amazingly, all our lenders and our sponsors, Sotheby's included, were incredibly supportive and committed to this project. So, in fact, what you see today is what you see in the catalogue. It's exactly the vision I had for the show, which is really remarkable given, you know, the fact that our current situation is not exactly stable.
Absolutely. Well, you've done such a brilliant job. I'm so excited for everyone to see it. So here in the slideshow, we see the opening room of the exhibition. Letizia, can you tell us about Artemisia's life and work and your vision for the exhibition in particular?
Sure. So as I said, it's essentially broadly chronological as an exhibition. So you really begin in Rome, where she's born at the end of the 16th century, and she's trained by her father, Orazio Gentileschi, who's also a painter, and she's trained alongside her brothers. And the very first picture we know by Artemisia is the picture that you encounter as you walk into the first room. It's the Susanna and the Elders, which you can see currently on the slide. And it's so impactful, and it's signed and dated. So we know she painted this when she was 16 or 17. I mean, it is absolutely astonishing that someone so young can paint something so accomplished. And so in this room, I wanted to sort of set the scene, but I also wanted to sort of hit people as soon as they walked through the doors of just how precocious her talent was. And there's a picture also by Orazio in this room, because Orazio was her father, her teacher, and also give a sense that Artemisia, unlike other male artists in her time, she wasn't able to sort of study the artworks on display around Rome. She was shut away at home, being an unmarried woman, and she really, you know, was exposed merely to her father's art, principally to her father's art. Also in this room, alongside the Susanna, is a remarkable object. It is the transcript of a trial. And one of the episodes that people know about Artemisia is the fact that she was raped by the painter Agostino Tassi when she was 17. And I borrowed the trial transcript for the very first time. It's often referred to, but it's shown here for the very first time in public. And going back to what I said at the beginning, I felt it was really important to sort of obviously touch on this major episode in her life, but to do so sensitively in a historical context. And you really get a sense of her personality, and you read the words and you hear her voice. And that's why I wanted this to be in that room. But this happened when she, you know, very early on in her life. So, you know, she has a long career after this, 40 plus years, where she works in Rome, in Florence, in Venice, in Naples, and also comes to London. So the show really, there's another 6 rooms after this first, you know, room. And you really, I think, follow in her footsteps.
Absolutely. So Eduardo, while Artemisia was very famous in her day, she later came to be seen as a lesser painting than her father, Orazio Gentileschi, an accomplished painter of his day. Am I right in saying that she has now been reassessed?
Yes, I think you're absolutely right to say she's been reassessed. The very fact that the Great National Gallery in London is dedicating an exhibition to her shows you how far we've come in this reassessment. Artemisia was a great painter, and she was recognized in her time, slightly forgotten, but I think for today's taste, she's fabulous because she has such movement in her art. She absorbed her father's lesson, and her father was a great master and a wonderful technician, it should be stressed. But perhaps for today's taste, and I say perhaps because I love Orazio as much as I love Artemisia, his compositions, his paintings are a little still. They lack the dynamism which Artemisia was able to bring to her work. It's unfair to compare them in a way because they're from different generations, and of course Artemisia benefited from learning from Orazio. But she really made Orazio's lesson her own and developed it and added so much to the style and to her period, I feel.
Absolutely. So Letizia, in the second room of the exhibition, we are confronted with these 2 brilliant and extraordinarily dramatic and dynamic large-scale paintings of Judith and Holofernes. Can you tell us about these 2 images that are side by side?
Sure. So the second room of the exhibition is called Becoming Artemisia in Florence, because after the rape trial, she moves to Florence, and it's here that she sort of turns a huge misfortune in her life into a real opportunity, and she gets out of Orazio's studio and really starts to forge her own career path. And it's a term that was coined by Keith Christensen at the Met, and I think it sort of encapsulates the fact that Artemisia finds her own way. And I mean, this is one of the great highlights of the exhibition, having these two pictures side by side. It's the very first time in the UK that we get to see this, and these are her most famous, her most iconic compositions, and I'm absolutely thrilled we were able to borrow both, because they're sort of there's as many differences as there are similarities between them. So she paints the one on the left when she's in Rome still, and that's today in Naples, and she probably brings it, or more likely a tracing of it, with her to Florence and produces the second larger version in Florence, almost certainly for the Grand Duke in Florence, for the Medici Grand Duke. And I mean, what strikes anyone looking at this picture is the sheer violence, the brutality of it. I mean, this is a familiar subject. It's an Old Testament subject where, Judith goes in and beheads the Assyrian general Holofernes to effectively save her city, which is under siege. And what Artemisia does is she's just a brilliant storyteller. And I think in this picture, you see her really stepping into the shoes of her protagonist. So she's imagining what it's like for Judith, what it's like for a woman who has to do this terrible deed. And it's actually a picture about kind of physical struggle. How would you go about doing this? So she changes the story, because the maidservant, who in the story is actually outside the tent keeping watch, standing by with a bag, ready to sort of put their booty and leg it. What Artemisia does is she brings her inside the tent, and she's pinning Holofernes down whilst Judith is sort of, really struggling in cutting off his head. So it's it's what she does so brilliantly is reimagine the story as a woman. And I think it's this real truthfulness that sets Artemisia apart. I mean, then you're sort of absolutely drawn to the gore. You're sort of horrified by it, but also weirdly drawn to it. And you start noticing the sort of spurts of blood splattering Judith's bodice and even her chest on her skin, and the way the hilt of the sword is pressing into the flesh of his arm. I mean, it is such a sort of a violent but very truthful imagining of the story.
Totally. I mean, when you witness these works in the flesh, they are just so overpowering and triumphant in a way. Eduardo, what are your thoughts on these works?
Well, I think they're extremely powerful visually, and as Letty's saying, how the story is changed, and how perhaps the layout of the characters is displayed in the picture. There's no hiding that a head is being cut off, and it's right in the forefront. And it's done actually through such simple lines. What the slide we're seeing now, we see a very strong vertical line, and then these two verticals that come into it and join right where Holofernes' head is. It's quite simple mathematical layout, but I think all the more powerful for it. You can feel the struggle, the force, and the weight of all the different parts coming together and centering on the head that is being severed. It's powerful stuff.
It definitely is. So having just witnessed Artemisia's range of self-portraits and these different defiant and triumphant guises, as well as one of her powerful Judith and Holofernes, in the next room, The Female Hero, we meet further examples of biblical heroines. Letizia, tell us about this room.
So this is one of my favorites, because The Female Hero is the title that Mary Garrard, or the subtitle, if you like, that Mary Garrard gave to her book in 1989. And Mary Garrard's book is really the first intentionally sort of feminist interpretation, or female interpretation, of Artemisia's work, and it's full of incredible insights. And of course, we associate a lot of these pictures in which there are female protagonists with Artemisia. She made her name really painting Susanna's, Bathsheba's, Cleopatra's, Lucretia's. So I wanted, in a way, to dedicate a room to it. And the pictures in this room are all from the 1620s, the time when Artemisia goes back to Rome, and it's considered by some really the kind of height of her career. And I think we have to remember that the subjects are not unusual in 17th century painting. And the patrons and collectors would have stipulated the subjects. They would have gone to Artemisia and commissioned them. But they knew that what they got from Artemisia is something that no male artist could provide. This was a female perspective, a feminine sensibility in painting these heroines. And this was, a unique selling point that Artemisia was fully aware of. And I think we have to remember, particularly with the images you're seeing here, which are sort of erotic and violent, and that there was an additional appeal for collectors in commissioning and owning works which show partial nudity or violence of women painted by a woman. And, we know that in the 17th century, these pictures were often commissioned, but also displayed together. You would put the Magdalene next to a Venus, and in a sort of boudoir space almost. The eroticism was not lost on contemporaries.
Absolutely. Eduardo, one of the most exciting examples is this recently discovered Magdalene, and the first time it's ever being seen alongside other works by Artemisia.
It's a lovely picture, and I love it for several reasons. The first is a technical reason, I suppose. I think carrying on from what Letty said, it's quite a disruptive picture in its composition, in how it's formulated. And what I mean by that is that the subject of, say, Susanna and the Elders or the Magdalene often, up to this point and subsequently, was used really as a vehicle for artists, usually men, to just have an excuse to portray the female nude. That's slightly simplifying, but often it was used in this way. And what I love about this picture is that Artemisia goes beyond that. She transcends that so comfortably. The Magdalene here is shown clothed. Yes, you can see that her blouse is starting to fall down, and it will reveal something later. But the erotic potential of this picture lies not in what could be crass nudity or unnecessary nudity, but in the fact that the Magdalene is certainly not at all penitent in this picture, but is in the throes of full-blown ecstasy. And that's something that, although one today has seen images similar to this, at the time that's a very, very powerful turnaround of a well-known scene. And I also love this picture, if I can introduce a personal note, is because when we sold it in Paris some 5 years ago, maybe 6 years ago, I was on the telephone with the person who turned out bought it. And I didn't know him terribly well at the time. I knew him a little bit. And I think he had a preset maximum he wanted to bid on the picture. And I took the liberty of suggesting quite strongly that he might want to go a little bit further. And lucky for me, but actually really lucky for him, he did. And he bought the picture. And I think it can be safely said that he's extremely proud and pleased with his purchase. He loves it, as do we all, I think.
Totally, what an amazing story. It's such a beautiful work. I mean, Eduardo, how do you see Artemisia within the context of the 17th century Italian old masters as a whole?
Well, she had some stiff competition. There were the first half, particularly of the 17th century in Rome, but in Italy more generally, was full of extremely talented artists who had no qualms in getting themselves about and finding patrons and competing with each other to produce great things. At the beginning of the century, the inescapable name, of course, is Caravaggio, and Artemisia is often grouped with the Caravagesque painters. That's a slightly lazy, I think, characterization of her or grouping of her, because while, of course, she takes Caravaggio's lesson, the theatrical potential of his violence and lighting, I think she's one step removed. She's one half generation later, and she's able to focus on some different things. It's not a direct reaction, but it's already part of her culture, this Caravagesque idiom. So on the one hand, you have Caravaggio and his tenebrism and this shift in focus from courtly subjects to more profane, touching on the vulgar at times subjects, to then other artists such as Guido Reni, who is the wonderful Guido, the Divino Guido. He was known even in his own lifetime, and pictures such as the David, which is in Paris, David holding the head of Goliath, which is, you can see there on your screen. That is an exceptional picture, don't get me wrong. It really is. The beauty, the finesse of it is second to none. But in terms of the passion it can inspire, or the emotion it can inspire, it's quite far removed from what Artemisia was interested in. I'm not saying Artemisia is better, they had different interests, but Guido's quite statuesque, if you look at this picture, relative to the power and movement that Artemisia strives for. So there are lots of competing currents within Italy, this part of the century, the first half of the 17th century. But another name that springs to mind is Rubens. Now, Rubens is not an Italian artist, but some very important formative years of his, right at the beginning of the 17th century, were spent in Italy. And while this picture, I don't know for sure whether it was painted in Italy, certainly would have painted shortly after his return to Antwerp from Italy, if it wasn't painted in Italy. This is now it's a lovely Santa Domitilla, which is in Bergamo. And the reason why I bring it up is because, like Artemisia, Rubens is not necessarily interested in precision. It's more about the potential in volume, the bounce and movement that one can achieve with paint. I find Rubens, in much the same way as Artemisia, is very voluptuous in his use of paint. Voluptuous is often used to describe Rubens as women, but perhaps it should be used to describe his paint and his interest in how paint can work. I think Artemisia does something very similar, certainly in an earlier stage in her career.
Absolutely. Letizia, why is Artemisia so important and popular today?
Gosh, I think really she's incredibly relatable. I think people can relate to her and to her story. I think she's very empowering. I think she's championed now as a sort of figure of resilience and of creativity, who faced, extraordinarily challenging odds. But most of all, I think you don't have to be an art historian to appreciate her, sort of the full force of her work. And so you can, I hope people will read my labels when they come to the exhibition, perhaps read the catalogue, but actually what I wanted to do with the show is just actually visually tell the story. And so you really don't have to read every label, and you don't have to know who Susanna and Judith are to appreciate her art. And I think it's the power of her sort of pictorial language which really moves people. And I think, when we took our self-portrait of St. Catherine around a very unusual tour of the UK, we took the picture to Glasgow Women's Library, to a GP surgery, to a women's prison, and to a school. The picture was seen by people who'd never stepped inside a museum. And what became very clear is that whether you're, a 15-year-old girl or an inmate in a prison, you have a very personal response to Artemisia, to her story, but also to her art. And I think that's why people, it's Artemisia mania right now. I think she's definitely a woman for our times.
Absolutely. So, Eduardo, I'd love to bring in some contemporary artists. I mean, which contemporary women artists do you feel is closest to Artemisia?
Well, I might just preface my answer by saying that my knowledge and understanding of contemporary art and artists is limited at best. But over this last July, we had a very successful mixed sale here in London. It was called Rembrandt Richter. And one of the pictures in that sale was this very, very big portrait of a head by Jenny Saville. And it struck me that Jenny Saville and Artemisia have many things in common. And one of them is the fact that they're both great painters and both great female painters, which is obvious and yet something that is not always touched upon in Jenny Saville's work, that she really can paint. She's mastered the use of paint in the same way I think that Artemisia did. And both of them are, I think, or to me, very disruptive. Disruptive in, well, Letty and I earlier talked about how Artemisia challenges perceptions in the way she lays things out. Traditional subjects are turned on their heads, seen from a different perspective. Now that has led many to read, probably quite rightly, as a proto-feminist approach to her work, in that she was shifting the male gaze. Well, similarly, I think Jenny Saville in this work, which is called Stare, the eyes are moved. It seemed to me it was a portrayal of an androgynous, probably a girl, age to be confirmed. I can't really tell, but the way the eyes have moved, the way the shape of the face has moved, it felt to me it was capturing a person at different stages in time, and that shifted my perception of what a portrait or a portrayal of a person, or whatever one might want to call it, is or might mean. And in other works by Jenny Saville, for example, there was a work we sold here 2 years ago, which is called Propped. We see a very direct and challenging view of a woman, of a woman's body. How should we as viewers approach this quite uncompromising, certainly not idealized view of the female form? And again, I thought that was very powerful, that it did something that Artemisia also did, take a standard view of a subject, turn it on its head, tell the story from a different angle. And here with this self-portrait sitting on a chair, Jenny Saville is challenging the centuries-old male gaze. I think there is a certainly not violence, but an uncomfortableness in the way the fingers dig into the thighs to say, well, what is it we're looking at? How are we looking at it? I think that's a very powerful thing. That's what I mean by disruptive. I don't think either of them necessarily question themselves through their work, but they invite us to challenge what we're looking at.
Absolutely. I mean, Letizia, do you have any thoughts on Artemisia's Cleopatra that's on the screen right now?
Yes, absolutely, because I think what this picture shows is Artemisia's understanding of the female form, and thinking about a sort of male-led narrative. This picture is thought by some to be by Orazio of Artemisia, and actually during the trial, some witnesses reported that Artemisia used to pose nude for her father, as if this was a very sort of shameful thing to do. And that was assumed for a long time. And I'm absolutely adamant, or at least in my view, that this picture is by Artemisia. And it's really her deep knowledge and intimacy, if you like, and of the human body. I mean, of the female body, and she really knows how to paint the female nude. Everything from sort of the weight of the breast to the sort of swelling stomach, and she loves these little creases under the armpits. You can see them also in the Magdalene and Ecstasy. And you compare her nudes to her father's, and she knows what a woman's body looks like. Now, whether she's painting herself or someone else in the studio, we don't know. But this is a woman who not only understands what a woman's body looks like, but she knows how women think. And I think this is very true for Artemisia's paintings.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting that the allegory of painting and Saville's self-portrait invite us to ask questions as well about what makes it the self.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the allegory of painting, which is also called a self-portrait as the allegory of painting by Artemisia, which is today in the Royal Collection, I think this is such a brilliant conflation of these two ideas of a kind of allegory, but also of a self-portrait. And, so much ink has been spilled about to what degree Artemisia is showing herself in this picture, both literally and figuratively. And I think actually in some ways it's besides the point. She knew that she could conflate these two traditions because the sort of allegory and personification of painting was by its very nature a woman. And because Artemisia is a female painter, by painting this subject, she's associating herself with the allegory in a way that no male artist could do. And the way she puts her initials really emphatically in the foreground beneath the painter's palette. I mean, there is no doubt you're meant to think of Artemisia when you see this picture. And for me, it embodies exactly her vision also of what painting is, which is this incredibly physical, energetic act. Here is a woman with her sleeves rolled up. She's ready to kind of launch herself into her next painting. And it always calls to mind, the words she writes to her patron, Don Antonio Ruffo, towards the end of her life, where she says, "Let me show your lordship what a woman can do." And in another letter she says, "With me you will not lose." She's the sort of winning ticket. I have the spirit of Caesar in the soul of a woman. And she was a really tough, resilient woman.
Can I jump in? Katie, I'd love to know, you've worked a lot, you've dedicated a lot of your time with your blog, The Great Women Artists. focusing on contemporary female artists. Has the Artemisia show made you think about in some other contemporary female artists in particular, or if so, who have you been thinking about?
Absolutely. I mean, it's so interesting. I think, like you were saying earlier, the fact that you don't even need to be an art historian to witness Artemisia's works. You can just feel them in the flesh. Anyone can witness them. And that's why I'd love to. A fantastic opportunity for me to bring in Toyin Oji Odutola, who is a Nigerian-born, New York-based artist who has recently opened an extraordinary exhibition at London's Barbican Centre, which I think fits so interestingly alongside Artemisia. Toyin's work is all about storytelling, which, when I was speaking to her the other day for my podcast, really reminded me of Artemisia's incredible ability to tell stories. Just like Artemisia engages with classical and biblical tales, but actually goes so far to create her own versions, just like we've seen in Judith and Holofernes, Toyin also engages in these mythic-like stories. However, instead of referencing historical stories, she actually makes them up entirely. She says the mind always comes before the pen, which I love, and I'm sure, the Renaissance artists thought about that before they even started painting. But she uses this idea of myth to create these extravagant and brilliant, timeless, mythic-like stories that could really have the potential to be told centuries ago or even now. For example, this beautiful work that we've got on the screen here came up for auction last year at Sotheby's. It's called Selective Histories. Comes from this incredible body of work that she made for her series A Matter of Fact, which was exhibited at the Museum of African Diaspora in San Francisco. And this work is just one piece in 18 works. This is the thing. I love what she does. She sort of creates these storyboards, and all these different pieces make up those words. And this was an intricate narrative around the extremely opulent but entirely fictitious Emeka family in the Nigerian Umutse Amara clan in order to probe and construct questions of wealth and race in contemporary culture. She also exhibited another chapter in the glorious exhibition To Wander Determined at the Whitney, which made up the union of two wealthy and aristocratic Nigerian clans who had come together to celebrate the marriage of two men and who were drenched in such opulent clothing and colour, which makes us question, the past and imagine if history had been told differently, which I think is what Artemisia is doing completely. She's telling historical stories from that feminist perspective.
Katie, more and more artists, I don't know, I'm sure you're aware, more and more contemporary artists are framing their exhibitions, their context in a what might be thought of as a more old mastery setting. I'm thinking Cecily Brown at Blenheim. How do you think this works? In what ways can that be successful, do you feel?
It totally does. I mean, recently I went to go and see Cecily Brown at Blenheim, which is a fantastic show, and also speak about her for my podcast. She adopts entirely from old master paintings. The National Gallery is her, and all the Met are her favourite museums in the world. However, although she loves the dramatism and the painterly approach, her works do not make up a narrative. We've got the stunning work that's coming up for auction. It's not so much about the narrative, but it's about adopting colours from Rubens, Titian, movement from Degas, and also see some of their work sort of purely through abstract colour, because I think that's what, when you get up close to the Artemisia works, the pure colours, I mean, you mentioned Rubens earlier, and when you get up close to them, they are almost like abstract paintings in themselves. I mean, her exhibition at Blenheim is centred around the house, but also hunting and battle scenes, which obviously, as you know, immensely popular subjects in old master painting. I mean, she really brings them to the present day by questioning their role in today's society, which I think is a very clever way of looking at history. One of her, as I mentioned, this fantastically sort of sumptuous part figurative, part abstract work is coming up for auction, which I think is going to do extremely well. And then, of course, another obvious comparison with Artemisia has to be the renowned British artist Tracey Emin, who, like Artemisia, puts herself and her life at the forefront of her work. I mean, when I entered the Becoming Artemisia room that you so beautifully curated, Letty, at the National Gallery, I was immediately brought back to Tracey's incredible exhibition, A Fortnight of Tears, at White Cube last year, and her amazing series of self-portraits, in a way, taken on her phone, which dealing with insomnia. And I've grown up with Tracey's work and understanding her life through her work. And it reminded me that she has this incredible ability to control her image and to control what part of her life she gives us. And I think, just like Artemisia, she gives us so much. much, and which brings me back to the room becoming Artemisia with her array of self-portraits, as it struck me how much Artemisia was in control of her image too, whether she be disguised as St. Catherine of Alexandria, but also the lute player. She was constantly giving us so much of herself, but doing it in a very sort of controlled way. So now we're going to take some questions, which I'm very excited about. We've had lots in. So what are the main, this is probably for you, Letizia, what are the main differences between the first two versions of Susanna and the Elders in this show? And how do these differences adjust our understanding of Artemisia?
So in fact, there are three Susannas in this show, because the show opens with Susanna, her very first known picture as a Susanna, her very last known picture, which she paints when she's almost 60 as a Susanna. And then there's a Susanna from the 1620s, that period, the female hero room. So those sort of three Susannas punctuate the show. And I was very keen for that to happen, because I think, once again, just by looking at those three pictures in a way, in our mind side by side, you just see how adaptable an artist she is. So her first Susanna is essentially a picture in which she's assimilated her father's style. So it's very like Orazio in technique. The one that she paints in the 1620s, you can see she's come back to Rome and she's looking again at Caravagge's painting. But actually there's a lot of Bolognese accents in it, this very lush Guercinese landscape. And this picture was painted, we know, in 1622. And the Pope had just been elected. He was a Bolognese Pope. So she's absolutely trying to cater to kind of the tastes of the moment. And then her final Susanna is just pure Neapolitan high Baroque. I mean, if these three pictures were not signed and dated, you would really struggle to say they were by the same artist. And I think that essentially is what's so tricky about Artemisia, but also so interesting. And it's often said she's a chameleon, and it's been seen as a very sort of negative thing. I don't see it as a negative thing at all. And I think it's really important to think about her sort of chameleonic style as a positive, because I think it shows her business acumen. She's an artist who constantly changed, who constantly adapted, who constantly absorbed, and really changed her style according to the kind of tastes of the patrons in the cities in which she worked.
Absolutely. And this one's for Eduardo. Speaking of masterpieces, does Sotheby's have any great old masters coming up for auction this year?
Yes, we do. We have plenty. Thank you for asking. Our next sale will be at the very beginning of December here in London. But before then, we have a lovely sale in New York, which will be on the 14th of October. There are a couple of Venetian masterpieces, one by Canaletto and one by Bellotto, which I would invite you to look on our website, where you'll find both catalogues online. I can't tell you much about the December sales yet, because the big reveal has not yet occurred, but watch this space.
Absolutely. And this might be for both of you. Any new insights into Artemisia Gentileschi time in Naples? Massimo Stanzione is still very collectible in terms of prices. What was their relationship? Haven't they painted many works together?
They have, absolutely. I mean, Stanzione, I hope I do him justice in this show, is a really key figure for Artemisia. She meets him in Rome, but he's a Neapolitan painter, and it's through him that she gets some of the most important collaborative commissions. And by collaborative, I mean her contributing works to series or cycles. One is for the King of Spain, for Philip IV, and Artemisia's pictures in the Prado, as are the other pictures by Stanzione. And the other is the Sant Januario, so one of three altarpieces Artemisia paints for the Basilica in Pozzuoli, also in the exhibition. And Stanzione is a really key figure for Artemisia. We have to remember, Artemisia was clearly welcomed into the artistic community in Naples, and that's not something that can be said for other foreigners who reached the city. I mean, Guido Reni was effectively driven out, Domenichino was poisoned, and I think it's so interesting to think that Artemisia was in a way accepted, and I think that's largely due to Stanzione. I think she was generally not really a threat because she was a woman. She wouldn't compete for the big commissions, that perhaps Reni and Domenichino were seen to sort of fight for, particularly fresco commissions, which she wasn't trained in.
Absolutely. And this one's for you, Letizia. I mean, can you tell us about Artemisia's contemporaries? I mean, were there any other women artists working, in the sort of 17th century Italian Baroque at the same time as her?
Absolutely, yes. And it's important to not think of Artemisia as unique. She is pretty exceptional in that she treats these sort of grand biblical, mythical, and historical subjects. But there are other, very, very successful painters, Lavinia Fontana, Sofoni's Banguisola, they tended to paint in different genres. One really key figure who's not that well known is Giovanna Garzoni. She paints these exquisite still lifes in sort of gouache on vellum, and the Uffizi have quite a number. And Giovanna is actually someone who also becomes, a member of the Artists Academy in Rome. She travels with Artemisia almost certainly to Venice, to Naples, and to London. So I think there are some sort of lesser known artists who were, equally successful in their own day, and perhaps they've sort of fallen by the wayside, like Artemisia, because, they've effectively not really been talked about by sort of contemporary biographers to the degree that male artists were.
Absolutely. And I've just had one for myself saying, who is the contemporary female artist that you are most excited about? Well, I'd love to take the opportunity to bring in also Floriak Novic, who is a fantastic young artist who actually really adopts from the old masters and reinterprets these fantastic works by Fragonard, by Boucher. Similarly to Artemisia, puts these into sort of the feminist lens and plays on those stories. So everyone do check out her. We've got another one. It's how appropriate or correct is it to interpret Artemisia's work as expressions of catharsis at her assault? Should we view her works with her experience in mind, or should the two be separated?
I think that's a very, it's an often asked question, but it's a very complex question. I think particularly the Judith beheading Holofernes is often seen, even some of the reviews of the exhibition have explicitly stated that it's really her revenge in paint against her rapist. I mean, I feel it's not doing her justice, actually. I think in seeing these pictures purely through the lens of her, of that episode, you actually end up diminishing her artistic achievements. But there is no question that she would have relished this role reversal of the powerful woman, overcoming a man. And I think, like Caravaggio, like any artist, I think her life is utterly intertwined with her art. You can't separate the two. But I think one has to be careful not to read everything through the lens of this episode, because she definitely put it behind her. It's really not mentioned by contemporaries, and once she leaves Rome, it's not talked about again. So, she had a very long career after that, and I think it may, of course, may have shaped her and her approach to painting, but it did not define her.
Absolutely, and I should add that this exhibition. Oh, sorry.
I was going to say, but I agree with absolutely everything Letty said. I think in much the same way as Van Gogh's tormented and tumultuous life would have radically informed his art and his painting, one can still appreciate the painting at face value. The fact that we know he cut off his ear and he painted himself bandaged up after he cut off his ear, that adds to the very full context we have of his life, and the noise around his life only brings us back to the art even more, and I think all the better for it. And I think in a similar way to Artemisia, the fact there is so much about her that she suffered, that she had to work through and get over, is great to draw the public's attention to her work. But her work can also be looked at just for its great beauty.
Absolutely. And how do you view, this is another one, how do you view Artemisia's time in Britain? Is it an important part of her artistic career?
Well, it's important to us in Britain, but it's a real puzzle. We don't know very much about it. We don't know when she arrived. We don't know when she left. We know she painted several pictures because they're mentioned in inventories. There's a sort of rather romantic notion that she comes to her father's side because he's dying, but we don't actually know that that's true. And we know that Charles I was desperately trying to get her to come to London for some time, and she was finding any possible excuse not to come. She was literally dispatching pictures across Europe to avoid coming to London. But having said that, it was her only sort of royal court patron, because she comes here and she's here for almost 2 years. And after her father dies, we know that she paints for Henrietta Maria. And, it's very interesting that despite sort of being hugely honoured and receiving many favours in London and being very well regarded, she's desperate to leave, and she goes back to Naples and sort of lives out the last sort of 15 years of her life there. I think there's still a lot to discover for her London period. There's a lot of pictures that are mentioned that have been lost. I think the relationship with Henrietta Maria is still very much to be sort of unpicked as well.
Absolutely. This one might be for you, Eduardo. Are there many falsely attributed paintings in the market?
Generally, or falsely attributed to Artemisia?
I guess with maybe Artemisia.
Well, I'm going to try and avoid the use of the word false, because it can lead to misunderstandings. There are lots of pictures which historically and even today are attributed to Artemisia. One has to bear in mind that in the field of old masters, very few pictures are documented, and many great masterpieces are not signed. So there are very few facts one works with when trying to establish an attribution. More recently, as Artemisia has become so popular, or has come to the public consciousness more, should we say, lots of hopeful attributions have been put forward, some more valid than others, should we say. But yes, as painters become better known, more works by them tend to, or more works given to them, correctly or not, tend to appear. I don't know if that answers the question while also avoiding it.
No, I just wanted to add something that, in a way, it's great. I mean, the National Gallery painting was only discovered, 3 years ago, and we bought it in 2018. And it's so interesting that with the acquisition of a picture like that, the fact that we've carefully restored it, we've studied it, we now know that that picture was created in the studio, alongside the self-portrait as a lute player in Hertford and the St. Catherine in the Uffizi, which, amazingly, they did x-rays of and found our picture underneath. So what's fascinating is she's using tracings to transfer bits of her design, not in a mechanical way, but that's something she learned from her father. And I suppose what I want to say is, with these new additions to her oeuvre that come on the market that are discovered, we are just at the beginning in terms of understanding her technique. And so with the acquisition of our picture, we now understand that she took these tracings, the way she operated, her working process was very like her father's, and now we know that these 3 pictures were produced probably in the studio at the same time. So I feel very excited, because it really is kind of just the beginning, I think.
Absolutely, and this is one for both of you. What can Artemisia teach the modern female painter?
One for you, Katie.
May I respectfully not answer that? Because I have no idea what it is to be a modern female painter, so I'm not sure I would know, other than great skill in painting.
Yes.
Learn how to do that, and then
For me, I think the very inspiring thing in sort of getting to know Artemisia, because I've obviously read her letters really thoroughly over the last couple of years and looked at her pictures very, very closely. I think she was determined to be considered on a par with her male contemporaries. And, we talk about her sort of the challenges she faced in her life, her rape. I would say the greatest challenge of all was to be taken seriously on her own as a successful female painter. And, her letters where she's defending her prices, there's letters in which she talks about her drawings being taken away and used by another artist. And she says, if I was a man, that would never have happened. She is absolutely adamant to be sort of judged on her own terms. And I think that is a really inspiring thing, and probably something that, really is relatable to artists today.
Absolutely. No, I think that was such a brilliant way to end. And that's all the time we have questions, all the questions we have time for. Thank you so much to our brilliant speakers, Letizia Treves and Eduardo Roberti. And of course, thank you so much to Sotheby's for hosting this fantastic conversation. I would love to remind you that the Sotheby's galleries in London are open to the public, so please feel free to come in and have a look at the works by phenomenal women artists in the upcoming sales that we've mentioned earlier. The Sotheby's Contemporary Evening Sale is on the 21st of October, while the Contemporary Day Sale is open for bidding online from the 15th to the 22nd of October. And finally, don't forget that you can book tickets to see the staggeringly brilliant Artemisia exhibition at the National Gallery in London, which runs until the 24th of January 2021. And thank you all so much for joining us today.